During my freshman and sophomore years in high school, I traveled to school by bicycle. It was faster than taking the bus because of the bus's winding route, and I was one of the earliest students picked up. Naturally, riding my bike was also quicker than walking. It took me approximately 10 minutes to bike to school. Once I exited my neighborhood, I would cycle along the roadside. Beyond that, I would continue on a larger, busier road, though it typically stayed pretty calm. We lived a short distance from the city, so traffic was rarely an issue. After following that major road for a while, I only needed to make one final turn before reaching the school. I would lock my bicycle on the rack out front and head inside. I really enjoyed this routine, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, until one particular morning. It was sometime in my sophomore year. I had just slung on my backpack and left the house. I got on my bike, rolled down the driveway, and turned onto the street. Soon I merged onto the bigger road. Around that time of year, whatever month it was, I recall it still being totally dark at that hour. Like I mentioned, the streets were generally quiet, but at that time of the morning, they were especially still. Typically, I'd only see 3 or 4 cars during my entire ride to school. On this particular day, a couple of minutes after I turned onto the busier road, a vehicle approached me from behind. I was riding along the space between the main lane and the ditch, probably 6 feet wide, giving me plenty of room. I expected the car to overtake me quickly, and when it did, I noticed it was traveling very slowly. It was a black sedan, relatively small, but I couldn't identify the make or model. I knew it wasn't unusual for a passing driver to reduce speed or even shift partly into the oncoming lane to avoid a cyclist. So that was my initial thought. However, this car stayed near me and decelerated to nearly match my pace, which was bizarrely slow for a car. That made me really notice it. I glanced over but couldn't see who was behind the wheel, and I had no memory of that vehicle at all. After a short while, it finally drifted ahead, still crawling, and only sped up when it was about 100 feet in front. It felt off and slightly alarming, but I arrived at school without further trouble. I also biked home later with no incident, not spotting the sedan again. But the very next morning I saw it once more. I left my driveway, not really thinking about the previous day, and pedaled onto the street. Then I went onto that same, larger road. A couple of minutes in, close to the same spot as before, I heard a vehicle coming up from behind. When I glanced back, I mostly saw headlights at first, but then the car slowed again. That's when I recalled the day before and thought, could it be the same one? As it pulled alongside me, sure enough, it appeared to be the same black sedan. I thought it was peculiar, but then I considered maybe it was just someone going to work on the same schedule as me. Still, I hadn't noticed them until the previous morning. I kept pedaling, minding my own business. The car matched my speed, staying right alongside me. We continued like that for an uncomfortable stretch, so I turned my head and saw it was likely a man driving, though I couldn't see details. I tried to pedal faster, and he edged forward too, matching my new pace. I then abruptly slowed, returning to my initial speed, and so did he. By then, I was truly creeped out. The road stretched straight with forests on both sides, plus a few scattered houses. None of that made me feel safer. Finally, the car surged ahead and past me. I felt relief seeing him move away. He drove a good distance up the road, but then I noticed his brake lights. Immediately, I got a bad feeling. He pulled over on the right shoulder and stopped. I wondered what he was doing and grew very uneasy. After the car came to a halt, the driver's door opened, and a tall, heavy-set man stepped out. He wore a black sweatshirt and had longer, dark hair. Still on my bike, I continued in his direction. As soon as he got out, he simply stood there next to the vehicle, facing me. He was staring straight at me as I got closer, and it made the hair on my neck stand up. I drew within maybe 100 feet of him before deciding I couldn't pass him. I abruptly swerved and made a U-turn on my bike. I wasn't about to try biking past that guy. I sped away, pedaling as hard as I could toward home. My heart pounded when I heard, in the distance, the thump of his car door shutting. Then the engine revved up. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the car turning around too. There was no way I could outrun it on my bicycle. In a split second, I veered left into the ditch, riding onto the grass and slamming on my brakes. I hopped off the bike and abandoned it, taking off on foot into the wooded area. I had to get away from him at all costs. I sprinted through the trees and tall weeds. Initially, I could still hear the car, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. Eventually, I emerged from the woods into an open field, with a lone house off in the distance. I rushed to the house and knocked on the front door. It sat on a quieter, curving road that probably linked back to the main road I'd been on. This neighborhood had only a few houses, spaced pretty far apart. No one answered my first knock, so I knocked again. Still no response. I circled around to the rear of the house and crouched down behind it, not wanting the man to track me there. I laid low and tried to be absolutely silent for a few minutes. After a bit, I considered returning to the front, but then I heard a car pass along that quiet street. I held my breath, realizing the car was creeping slowly. It went by, seemed to flip around, and passed by again. Though I never got a good look, I had no doubt it was him. When the engine faded, I stayed hidden for about 5 more minutes before finally heading around the house and back into the woods. My bike was still where I'd left it in the ditch. I picked it up, got on, and rode home as fast as possible without seeing that car again. Safely back, I recounted everything to my mom. She phoned the police, and I was excused from class that day. From then on, she drove me in the mornings. The next year, once I got my driver's license, I took myself to school. I'll never forget that experience, and am immensely thankful I managed to escape from that man. Story 2. This event occurred last year while I was shopping at a local Walmart. It was a random weeknight, probably around 8 or 9 in the evening, and the store wasn't busy. After about 15 minutes of browsing, I found myself in the fitness aisle, checking out a massage gun. I wasn't committed to buying one that day, or even from Walmart, but I was curious. As I stood there reading the box, I heard voices in the next aisle over, which happened to be the toy section located in the back corner of the store. One voice was an adult male, and the other belonged to a child. At first, I paid no mind, but soon the man said, "I'll buy you this toy if you come with me." Initially, I assumed he was the child's father, though the phrasing struck me as odd. I didn't catch the kid's reply, but the man continued, "Your mom said it's fine." That's when I had a strange feeling. Maybe he wasn't her dad. He then repeated, "Come on, let's go," multiple times. I got a serious gut check from it. I wasn't sure if I was overstepping by intervening, but I decided to walk by the aisle to see what was actually going on. Leaving the fitness aisle, I looked down the toy aisle and spotted a man wearing a black coat and a winter hat, guiding a little girl by the hand toward the aisle's far end. Their backs were to me. In a split-second decision, I grabbed a random stuffed toy off the shelf and called out, "Excuse me." The man spun around, looking caught off guard. Approaching, I held up the toy, asking, "Would this be a good present for my niece?" He hesitated before saying he wasn't sure. I pressed further, telling him I thought he might know, then asked, "Is this your daughter?" He said no, quickly adding he was just watching her for a moment, and insisted they needed to leave. He then tried to continue on with the child. I wasn't certain if I'd misread the situation, so I allowed them to walk off. Perhaps he had a legitimate reason. I turned around, telling myself I was just being overly suspicious. About 30 seconds later, I heard a woman calling out a name. Let's say, Sarah. She was clearly worried, speaking loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. I followed her voice and found her a couple of aisles over, closer to the center of the store. I asked if Sarah was her daughter. She confirmed it and seemed anxious. I told her I might have just seen Sarah being led away by a man, possibly heading toward the store's front. We both took off running in that direction. Thankfully, it had only been about a minute since my encounter. We arrived at the front and saw the man and the girl at the self-checkout lanes. He was about to purchase a toy for her. The mother started yelling, and the man tried to defend himself, claiming he only intended to buy the child a toy as a nice gesture. Realizing no one would believe him, he dashed for the exit and fled. I was just relieved the girl was reunited with her mother. It emerged that the girl had wandered to the toy section alone while her mom shopped elsewhere, believing her daughter was close by. Shortly after, I found out that law enforcement located the man. I'm grateful everything ended with the little girl safe, and I'm glad I trusted my instincts to intervene. Story 3. I'm going to share a disturbing story involving a former neighbor of mine. I live in a single-family home with my wife and our dog, Sparky, in a residential area. Most houses on our street each have about an acre of land. We've been here for 5 years, ever since we got married. About a year after we moved in, a man named Dan moved in next door. Right from the beginning, he was confrontational, vulgar, and perpetually causing issues. I was aware he had recently gone through a divorce, but that didn't justify his behavior. By way of background, while the houses on our street aren't massive, people usually keep up their yards and gardens. The first time I spoke to Dan, he criticized the flowers we'd planted, suggesting we replace them because they looked terrible. He also ridiculed my car, a Ford Fusion, saying it was garbage. He wasn't joking either. He insulted my wife as well, calling our home the ugliest on the street. I overheard this and came outside to see him, clearly drunk, yelling at me to fucks off. After those initial run-ins, I decided to keep my distance as best I could. Then about a month later, Dan confronted us again, complaining about our dog. He demanded that we keep Sparky indoors. We typically let Sparky out on a leash in our front or backyard, with a stake in the ground. The leash never reached Dan's property. He said he hated dogs and didn't want to see ours in the front yard. I stood my ground and Dan left, fuming. We tried to avoid him afterward, but he kept bothering us by leaving his old junk on our property. We had no fence at the time, but the boundaries were marked. Once, I discovered an ancient canoe basically on our side, and another time, a broken patio table. I'd had enough, so I moved them back onto his land, thinking about installing a fence just to keep him out. One evening, my wife came in telling me Sparky was missing. He'd been out on the leash like always, yet now the leash and collar were there, but Sparky wasn't. We considered that he might have slipped free, but the collar was still attached to the leash, so it made little sense. We canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors. Nobody had seen him. Around 9 at night, I went out to our backyard as my wife kept calling neighbors. That's when I heard a faint barking sound coming from Dan's yard. I called Sparky's name and the barking got louder, seeming to come from inside Dan's shed. It was locked up with a robust padlock. I rushed over to Dan's front door and pounded on it, yelling for him to open up, but no response. After 5 minutes, I dialed the police. When the officers arrived, they heard Sparky barking too. They cut the lock and opened the shed door, finding him inside, shaken but unharmed. Dan had confined him in there. We pressed charges, though the outcome was just probation for him. He was also compelled to move away. I was relieved to see him leave, and I'm grateful we got Sparky back safe and sound. Story 4. This occurred during the summer of 2021. I had just purchased a new vehicle, and I put my 2004 Chevy Trailblazer up for sale on Craigslist. Even though it was older, it was dependable enough that I priced it at $22,000. I wasn't in a rush, and after a couple of days, someone messaged me to ask if the SUV was still available. When I confirmed it, they asked to see it. We scheduled a meetup for the following day after he got off work. The person introduced himself as Barry and said he'd finish around 8 p.m. I suggested a Walmart parking lot nearby. It was big, reasonably safe, and more public than my driveway. Barry agreed to meet there. The next day, I arrived a bit early and parked in the far end of the lot, where you might see trucks or RVs overnight. Then something odd happened. Barry texted to inquire about my car's appearance. That struck me as strange since he would have seen the ad photos. Nonetheless, I gave a description: a gray SUV parked in the back corner. Soon, a red Ford Focus pulled up next to me. A man in his 30s got out, sporting dark hair and black-rimmed glasses. We exchanged greetings and I gave him a quick tour of the SUV. He immediately asked if he could test drive it, and I agreed, taking the passenger seat while Barry drove. As we set off, Barry kept fiddling with his phone. This made me uneasy, so I asked him to focus on the road, and he apologized. We headed into a quieter area lined with industrial buildings. speed limit around 35 miles per hour. Barry didn't talk much, which put me on edge. After a few minutes, I suggested heading back. That's when things got unsettling. Barry slowed down and pulled into a crumbling parking lot next to an old, run-down warehouse. Another car was parked there, and I noticed 3 men inside it. I assumed Barry was just turning around, but instead he shut off the engine, grabbed the key from the ignition, and jumped out of the SUV. He shouted for me to get out. At the same time, the 3 men in the other vehicle got out and began walking in our direction, around 50 feet away. Barry stood in front of my SUV, waving for me to exit and yelling. I realized I was in serious danger. Luckily, I had brought along the spare key in my pocket in case the SUV sold that night. As Barry neared the passenger door, I pushed the lock button on my spare. He tugged the handle, but it was locked. Moving quickly, I slid into the driver's seat, inserted the spare key, and started the engine. Barry still held the original key, but he hadn't unlocked the door again yet. With the engine running, I saw Barry reach into his pocket while the 3 men closed in, now about 20 feet away. I floored the gas, cutting the wheel to evade them. I heard them shout as they raced back to their own car, but I managed to get onto the road. Once I was clear, I took the first turn I saw, making sure they weren't trailing me. I never noticed them behind me again and got home safely. I reported the incident to the police, describing Barry, his stolen car at Walmart, and everything else. I'm not sure if they ever caught him or his cohorts, but I'm immensely thankful I had that spare key that day. Story 5. I was 15 and in my second year of high school when this occurred. I was hanging out with a couple of friends before classes began, chatting about typical teenage stuff. Eventually, the warning bell chimed, so we headed off in different directions for our first period classes. I walked slowly because my teacher, Coach Thompson, was known for being lenient about punctuality. He often got a late start himself since he was always juggling coaching responsibilities. So, I didn't worry much about getting there right as the bell rang. While I was making my way, the last bell sounded, signifying class had begun. The hallways instantly grew quiet. Suddenly, the loudspeaker crackled, announcing that we were going into a lockdown. It made little sense to me. Things had been normal moments ago. I assumed it had to be a mix-up or maybe a drill. But as I reached the hallway near my classroom, I stopped cold. Standing at the far end was a big man in a ski mask and all black clothes, including combat boots. He held a large, dark duffel bag. He turned his head just enough to see me. Alarmed, I ducked back around the corner. My classroom was in the same hallway as that masked figure, so I couldn't go there safely. The corridor was dead silent, and my anxiety shot up. I was well acquainted with the building after 2 years, so I decided the closest place to hide was a nearby bathroom. I slipped in and took cover in one of the stalls, trying to calm my breathing. I stayed there a long time, maybe half an hour, though it felt much longer. At one point I heard faint footsteps outside, but whoever it was continued on, and the bathroom remained quiet. Eventually, I decided I should try leaving. When I stepped out, the halls were still deserted, and the lockdown hadn't lifted. I crept back toward my classroom, carefully checking every corner. I made it about halfway when the sound of footsteps got louder from a hall just ahead. My pulse skyrocketed again. I reversed direction, moving down another hallway, and in a brief glance behind me, I saw the man in the ski mask rounding the corner. Panic washed over me and I started sprinting. I ran faster than I ever had before, feeling like my life depended on it. I only slowed after putting considerable distance between us, then looked for an exit. Fortunately, as soon as I reached the door, I saw several police officers stationed outside. I bolted for the exit and the officers waved me over. I got out safely, learning that the authorities had already arrived to handle the situation. The masked intruder was apprehended soon after, though I never heard the exact reason for his presence. Thankfully, no one was harmed. The terror of that day stuck with me for some time. My parents arranged therapy sessions to help me cope. At 15, I was too young for such a traumatic episode, but honestly, no one should have to go through that at any age. It's been about 7 years and life is much better now. The school resumed normal schedules, and they hired a permanent security officer for the following year, which eased everyone's nerves. I'm so grateful the incident ended without injuries, but I still hope never to experience anything that frightening again. Story 6. This took place when I was around 10 or 12 years old, a long while back. Even so, the memory remains with me because it was so unsettling and bizarre. To give context, this happened in the early 2000s, when cell phones weren't widespread the way they are now. My parents did own them, but we mostly relied on our landline at home. We had maybe 2 or 3 phones spread between the kitchen and living room. We also didn't have caller ID, so the only way to know who was calling was to pick up. One evening, my parents left to do some shopping, and I stayed behind as I often did for short errands. After about an hour, I was in the kitchen when the phone rang. Assuming it was just my parents checking in, I answered. Instead, a man's voice came through, oddly slow and not familiar at all. He asked who I was in a strange manner. Feeling uneasy, I just hung up. He never called back that night. A few days later, though, he phoned again. By then, my parents had gone to bed and I was alone in the living room, watching TV late on a Friday. The clock read around 11 p.m. It was unusual for us to get calls that late, so I was immediately on alert. I didn't pick up and the call went to voicemail, which we could hear in real time. It was the same man's voice saying, "Hey, I figured you'd be there tonight." Then he paused and hung up. The whole thing creeped me out. I had no idea who he might be. My parents never mentioned anyone who would call us like that, especially late at night. After re-listening to the voicemail, I tried to forget it and eventually went to sleep. The next day, I forgot to mention it to my parents. That evening, while we were all in the living room, the phone rang again. My mom answered but quickly hung up, saying whoever it was didn't speak. My dad guessed it might be a wrong number, but that jogged my memory and I told them about the weird calls. We played the voicemail, and we all agreed it was disturbing. No more calls came that night. We heard nothing for about a week. Then, one night, my parents went out again, leaving me alone. The phone rang once more. Thinking it could be them, I answered. But the same voice asked something before I hung up in a rush. Immediately, the phone rang again. I avoided it, and he left a message this time saying, "I can see that you're home right now." Those words terrified me. Could he actually see me? I peeked out the living room window and noticed a car parked on the curb a little down the street with its engine running. That was peculiar. People rarely parked there. Panicked, I grabbed the phone and called my mom. She said they'd come home immediately. I didn't dare look outside anymore. I crouched behind the couch until my parents arrived about 10 minutes later. By then, the car was gone. After that, my parents didn't let me stay home alone for quite some time. We even unplugged our landline for about a month. When we finally reconnected it, the strange caller never rang again. I can't be absolutely sure it was him in that parked vehicle, but I highly suspect it. To this day, I have no clue who he was or why he fixated on calling us.